Hello everybody and welcome to FEC TV, the shiny new pixel-based partner to Britain's best biking podcast, Front End Chatter. With him, Simon Hargreaves.
And him, Martin Fitzgibbons.
And a special guest today, a very special guest, is Triumph's new Daytona 660. In fact, it's such a special guest that it hasn't actually been announced yet. We've managed to travel through time to get a sneak peek about it.
How did we do that?
It's pretty special, really, isn't it? Because it's been a few years since Triumph's had a Daytona in its lineup, certainly a full-time, mass-produced, mass-market Daytona. And it's a name that goes back an awful long way for Triumph. It goes back further than me. It goes back to the 1960s. When were you born?
1967.
Goes back further than both of us.
Further than me? Wow, it is old.
And over the years, I guess we've both ridden quite a few Daytonas in our days on Bike Magazine and Performance Bikes Magazine.
Yeah, I mean, the first Daytona I bumped into was the Daytona 1000 in 1992.
Goodness.
I think, which was a long time ago. And I've just noticed one. They've got one in the museum.
So
it's kind of evoking old memories. That was one of the Hinckley's first bikes, I think.
Yeah.
But subsequent to that, we've had, of course, when was the name resurrected after that? There was a few Daytonas, wasn't there? There was the T595?
The T595 kind of felt like the first time Triumph were maybe getting kind of modern 90s serious sports bike, didn't it?
It was a good effort. There were a lot of firsts in there.
There were. My first taste of it was the Daytona 650, which was the kind of second and a half generation middleweight sports bike they built after the TT 600, the Daytona 600, and then they had this one weird year of the 650, and I lived with one of those. I did absolutely everything on it for a year. I had no car, so it was my daily commuter, it was my track bike. I crashed it, I toured on it, I ran it out of, I did everything on it. It was amazing. And then the mighty 675 came along. And wow, what a game changer that was.
Well, we were both present at the birth of that bike, almost literally, because we were invited here to Hinckley to see it being unveiled in a sort of a top secret unveiling. And that was a proper mind-bending machine at the time. It elevated Triumph from kind of the also-rans to the top of the class, of the Super Sport 600 class, which in the mid-2000s was populated by some excellent other machinery. CBR 600s and the R6 had just come out, but it rose above them all, due in part because it had a 675 motor, not a 600 motor, a little bit cheaty. But,
but a triple rather than a four. So they were doing things their own way. It was what Triumph were doing at their absolute best in the mid-2000s. And I was kind of quite a newbie on Bike Magazine at the time, but I remember being part of that first group test when we went to the south of France with it. And it blew me away. It was absolutely by far and away my favourite on the road and on the track. It was a phenomenal thing. And there was no just loving it because it was British or any of that nonsense. It was just a phenomenal bike. And for me, it was the best supersport bike you could buy in the mid-2000s.
And it sort of evolved over the years. There were a few iterations of it, or one, a major change. But you did get the slightest feeling that Triumph were they came in right as the party was ending.
Yes.
They got right to the top of the class straight away, but it was just a little bit too late. Because by 2007, 2008, 2009, things were moving on a bit. And Supersport 600s weren't the focus of people's attentions quite as much.
No, I think we were moving on. I think as British motorcyclists, we were moving on. For a sense of scale, in 2000, there were more than 13,000 Supersport bikes sold in Britain. 10 years later, it was just 3,000. And 10 years after that, by 2020, it was 300.
Wow.
The scale of the decline of the kind of mass market for Supersport 600s is like nothing else I've ever seen in my motorcycling lifetime. No other bike has kind of burned so bright and died out so quickly.
Yeah.
And it's kind of telling, actually, because Triumph had, the last full-time kind of mass-produced Daytona was the 675 in 2016. I think it was discontinued for 17. They had the limited run Moto 2 765.
Yeah.
And then they haven't had anything. They haven't even had a full-fed bike in the range. So this, the 660, is the return of the Triumph full fairing, let alone the Triumph sports bike.
That's a good point, yeah. And it's interesting where it's positioned. I mean, we can start diving into the spec, because we should start talking about it. Since we sat in front of it, we're reminiscing about good old times.
Yeah, the reminiscing's lovely, but actually the context is important, because what this isn't is a sequel to the 765 or the 675.
Yeah.
It's not, in film terms, it's not like the last one, but more and bigger. This is more like, I don't know, in film terms, it's more like a prequel or more like a reboot of the series, a reboot of the Daytona franchise.
It's like the TV spin-off, I think, isn't it? You know,
maybe. Slightly different actors, and you're wondering what's going on.
Yeah.
So what this isn't, and we should probably say this right up front for those who are hoping that what we're about to talk about is semi-active Öhlins and 17-way IMUs, is that this is not the most extreme, most track-focused super sports bike that anyone has ever built.
And it's not a shock, try and freely admit that.
Yeah, this is not criticism. This is like purposefully built a more comfortable, more affordable, more versatile, more road-focused middleweight sports bike.
And cheaper.
And much, much more affordable, yes.
Yeah. So should we whiz through the spec of the bike then? I mean, we've got its context now, you know.
Well, should we start with the engine then? Because this actually is the one bit of the bike that does have a definite direct lineage to the 675.
Yeah.
Because although this is a 660cc triple, it has a 74mm bore and a 51.1mm stroke. It's the same bore and it's basically the same engine, albeit with a slightly reduced stroke as that 675.
Yeah.
Now, 660cc triple, probably, if you're a canny man like I know you are, you're instantly thinking Trident and you're thinking Tiger Sport 660.
Yeah.
The good news is that this isn't just a Trident with a full fairing. This engine has been tuned up from Trident spec, isn't it?
It has, which was a bit of a surprise to find out that it's making more power and I think a smidge more torque and more revs. Normally with platform engineering, the engine is a straight swap from model to model to model. And again, if you think of Suzuki's GSX-8R and the AS, you know, and the V-Strom, it's the same engine, it's the same power. It's a bit of a surprise when Triumph announced that this was making...
This now makes 94 horsepower at 11,250 revs, which is up probably 14 horsepower
13,
or so
14
from the
horsepower,
Trident.
yeah.
That's a significant difference. Like you said, the torque is up as well. It's now 51 lub-foots at 8,250 RPM. Mm-hmm. And the red line, like you said, more revs. The red line is now up to 12,650 RPM. So it'll scream. I mean, that's the same red line as the first generation Street Triple had, which nobody ever accused of not being an interesting engine.
Yeah.
So the power at 94 horsepower. Now, there is a reason for that. And if you're watching and thinking, why doesn't it make 120 or 130 or 140 horse? The 94 horsepower is to do with European licensing and the fact that if you want an A2 license, if you're a younger rider, that can only be... You have to ride a bike that can be restricted down from 94 horsepower as a maximum.
That's correct, yeah.
So that's to open this up to younger riders.
Yep.
On an A2 license.
Yeah, so we have, but the work that Triumph have done to the engine, it's not just a bit of fueling.
No, what they haven't done is plugged a computer in and gone 80 to 94 save.
It's not noughts and ones.
There's a lot of physical metal changes. So if we start, there's a different airbox, there's new throttle bodies, there's new intake ports, there's new pistons, there's new cams with higher lift and longer duration, there's a new crank, there's new cylinder head, there's larger exhaust valves. I mean, it's massively different. Where the Trident has a single throttle body, this now has three 44mm throttle bodies, exactly like the Daytona 675.
Daytona 675, yeah.
Increased compression ratio as well. So it's more of everything. This is properly putting the motor back up to the maximum that you could expect a bike that still wants to be A2 compliant to have.
Yeah. That is a significant amount of work, and that does stretch the definition of platform engineering a little bit.
Exactly.
But there is a context as well. If you think about, they're claiming 81 horsepower, I think. 94 horsepower.
Yep.
Yeah. For context, that takes us back to early CBR 600s.
Yeah.
It's kind of that era, that Super Sport 600 thing. So although this isn't a Super Sport 600, it does that kind of performance is something that we would have considered normal at the height of the super sport, boom almost in the 90s.
Absolutely. If you want to get really nerdy, and you mentioned the Daytona 1000 from the early 90s.
Yeah.
There was a 3-cylinder version of that as well, wasn't there?
Yeah.
Called the Daytona 750.
750.
I mean, that really was platform engineering. Cut one off. And that made about 95 and 96 horsepower from memory.
Yeah.
So we've now got the same amount of power out of a 660 engine rather than a 750 engine.
Perfect.
Yeah, I think so.
It'll be a screamer and it will fly.
Yeah. I mean, on top of that, there's lots of other things Triumph have done. They've changed pretty much every internal gear ratio.
Ah, the gearing's different.
They've changed the final drive ratio, because when you have more revs of an engine, to maintain the same top speed, you can afford to run the gearing shorter. And Triumph's top engineering boffins reckon that in every gear, at every engine speed, there's more acceleration than the Trident.
That would make sense. And it's a closer ratio gearbox as well. So I think they've closed the whole thing up.
Yeah. So that sounds really promising to me.
So yeah, we've got a great little screamy little kind of powerful engine in its class.
Yep.
What have we got with the chassis?
Well, to look at, you might look at these little panels and think this looks like a kind of a nice twin spar aluminium cast frame, but that's a funny kind of aluminium, isn't it?
Is there a steel tube under there?
There is a steel tube under there. Now, I think it's a steel tube perimeter frame. My guess is it's exactly the same metalwork as the Trident. Triumph say that there's a different steering head angle, different geometry, but my slightly cynical brain wonders if that difference in geometry isn't just due to a longer rear shock pitching the bike kind of slightly more nose heavy. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so the rake angle has been tightened up from 24.6
to
23.8, which is quite an aggressive head angle.
It is. Triumph have run fairly aggressive head angles in the past. I remember when we used to do spec panels, it was always like, can we double check that figure? Because that seems really steep.
And if you think that's sharp, when we get to trail,
Yeah.
which is some convoluted measurement of the front end, and the people who know what trail is, but basically the less trail you have, the faster the bike steers into corners. This trail is down almost an inch from the Trident. It's down to less than, it's 82 millimetres, 82.3 millimetres.
See, I can't remember in 30 years of doing this a trail figure sort of less than that, unless it was some kind of weird hub center steered thing, which might have had inverse trail or whatever, negative trail. But no, that's extreme. That's pretty extreme.
So this is setting itself up to be quite an agile beast.
Yeah, and just a visual overlay, it is quite a lot shorter, I think, than, say, for example, the CBR 650. We're not exactly sure. I think they haven't quoted a wheelbase yet, have they? Or have they?
I can't remember off the top of my head.
Don't think they have, but it looks visually it's quite compact machine.
Yeah.
Okay, and in terms of suspension and the rest of the chassis, what else have we got?
So I think this is perhaps where some of that expectation adjustment needs to come in, because if you are hoping for fully adjustable, high quality, top shelf suspension like the glory days of super sports bikes, certainly like the 675Rs and like the last Moto 2 765, this is not that, and there's a good reason for that.
It's not bristling with adjusters, is it?
It's not from the highest shelf in the warehouse, is it? But what it is Showa, unadjustable, 41mm, upside down, what do they call them? Separate function forks,
something
I
like
think?
that, yeah.
So no adjustment at the front. At the back, there's a linkage-free monoshock with...
It's cantilever shock, I think it is.
Yeah, I can spy a little stepped preload adjuster.
There's a preload at the back,
but no dampen adjusters to be found front or back.
Okay.
So again, you might hear that and think, oh, my Daytona's got...
I think there's two things to talk about there. I think one is that's fairly standard in the class. And I think if you actually, again, look at the spec panel, you'll find that those Showa separate function forks exist on Honda CBR 650R. I think you'll find them on GSX-8S.
Really?
GSX-8R.
Oh, okay.
There's a lot of Showa sort of... and I think one of the comments we've made about those two bikes is how good that basic Showa suspension is.
Absolutely. Lacking adjustment doesn't mean lacking good ride quality.
No. It's really quite versatile stuff. It doesn't mean it's a harsh ride. I think that's more dictated by what Triumph have chosen to do with the actual suspension travel. But again, though, I don't think we even know what those figures are. But anyway, it's getting a bit detailed about it. And then I guess we have fairly standard-looking brakes as well. Nice Triumph logo on the calipers. I'd like to know who makes them.
I think it's J. Joanne.
Is it?
I think it is. That's not a fact.
No,
that's a guesswork.
It's a good guess. Okay.
But again, you've brought up brakes. They are another upgrade or change from Trident spec.
Yeah.
So where the Trident has Nissin 2-pot sliding calipers, these are now 4-piston radials.
Radials, yeah. Okay. On same size... Again, same sort of spec actually as its rivals. 3 10mm discs, 4-pot caliper. Yeah, okay. It's
17-inch wheels.
Quite familiar so far.
Yeah, standard super sport size tyres. It's wearing Michelin new Power 6 tyres, which I don't think I've ridden on.
No.
But which are being pitched as a good sporty road tyre. They're not being pitched as a track tyre, just as the suspension is not being pitched as track suspension, and just as really the whole bike is not being pitched as a Moto2 replica or any kind of track aspiration. This is firmly intended and sold as a road-going, middleweight, sporty-looking road bike.
I think, again, Triumph have used the words road-focused,
Yeah.
sporty, but road, road is where it's at. It's worth saying, so 180/55 on the rear?
Sure.
So again, that's kind of in keeping with the rest of the class. Okay. I'm just thinking, what else have we got in terms of chassis? That's kind of where we are with that, I think, unless we've missed something. What about the actual ergonomics of the bike? Because I think that's the thing that really defines its class, and whether it is a super sports bike or just a kind of a sporty road bike.
Yeah, definitely. I had a little sit on this one earlier, and it is nowhere near as aggressive a riding position as the Daytona 675, for example. So I lived with one of those for a year. Actually, funnily enough, I crashed that one, blew that one up, ran that one out of oil, did everything with it. But I do remember, even in my 20s, finding a Daytona 675's riding position quite aggressive.
It was quite extreme.
Not cramped necessarily between seat and peg. It had quite good leg room, but it was quite wrist-heavy riding position.
Yeah.
And this doesn't feel like that. You can see the clip-on. They are clip-ons. It's not like a one-piece handlebar. The clip-ons are very slightly rising the handlebars above the top yoke.
They're above
but
the
it's
top yoke.
millimeters rather than some giant kind of high-rise pretend roadster.
Yeah. It's very CBR. Again, we'll talk about rivals perhaps at the end, but it is very CBR 650R-ish, which is a really nice, generic, not too wrist-heavy. I think the big test is, if riding through some average speed cameras, do your wrists ache?
Yeah, sure.
That is the test of a sporty riding position, I think.
Yeah, I think you're right.
But, okay, and the pegs, I think, comparing it just ridiculously with the Trident, which is loosely, kind of, it's obviously the pegs are higher, they're further back, and obviously the bars are lower.
Further forwards, probably pulled in a bit tighter.
So,
I think.
yeah.
The one thing I think is also worth mentioning is seat height.
Okay.
Because I found the 675 a really tall bike. That on paper, it wasn't a really big number, but I think either the shock was made out of granite or it had, I don't know, the preload was set really mad from the factory. And you had to be quite a tall rider to get on with the 675. When you hear Triumph say things like, we fitted a longer shock to pick the back end of the bike up, you might naturally start thinking,
is it going to be
tall?
tall?
Gone a bit tall again.
Yeah.
But it's only 810 mil, and which is a pretty average height for a bike these days. Very accessible.
Fits into the spec of the category.
And it's only 5 millimeters taller than the Trident. So a bike that is super accessible. Essentially, if you can fit on a Trident, you'll be able to fit on a Daytona 660.
And it's worth mentioning, there is an accessory seat, I think, that goes down to 785 millimeters.
Wow.
So that is, that's a custom bike. It's almost it's riding a cruiser. Yeah.
So ergonomics, very accessible. Definitely not a track-focused ergonomic. Definitely one for all riders of all sizes, and like I said, to be comfortable on the road.
Okay, that's
tech
cool.
spec?
What have we got in terms of gadgets and tech? Have we got an up and down quick shifter?
Well, if Sir ticks the box on Sir or Madam's order form, so there isn't one as standard, but there is one that's an optional accessory.
Okay.
I haven't seen an official price for it, but my guess, given how much the Trident one costs, is that it'd be about 300 quid.
Okay. Right.
But it is up and down, which isn't an option available to all of its rivals.
Understood, yeah. Okay.
It can be up and down because it's got rubber wire throttle. It's got a rubber wire throttle, which also gives it access to traction control, to 3 riding modes, to... I think there's some new emergency braking flashy light system.
I just recently did the Tiger 900 launch, and they've just equipped that. So I think it's something that Conti, who make the ABS unit, I think they've kind of said, we can do this emergency flashing light thing. Honda do it. I think BMW do it now. A lot of people are doing it. Yeah. I know on the Tiger, it goes off really easily.
Does it?
Yeah, it's so distracting. So I'm guessing this will be the same. If you brake fairly hard, you'll have your indicators flashing all over the place.
Speaking of indicators, it's all LED lighting. There's not a bulb to be found. And the dash is the dash is a kind of hybrid of LCD and TFT, isn't it?
Yeah.
Mostly kind of white on black.
You still got the speed and the tacho is kind of LED, and then there's like is that right? And then there's a little TFT box underneath
like a tiny little postage stamp size TFT bit, which I think lets Triumph say it's got a TFT dash, but it's not like a big
it's not glorious
CBR
Technicolor
or GSX style TFT dash. So that's perhaps one area on paper.
And there's a few other boxes you can tick when you're speccing. I noticed it didn't have a USB port. Turns out the USB is also an optional extra.
Is it?
It is, yeah. And obviously you can get heated grips as well. And it's worth saying it doesn't come with cruise control.
No cruise control, no option for it.
Nothing, I think, roughly at this price point in this category does.
Not at this price point.
Yeah.
The closest you could get would be
the Aprilia?
The RS660.
Yeah,
yes,
the
which does
Aprilia
have cruise if you want to pay £2,000 more for it. Do you want to jump to price? Things kind of flirted around the edges of price.
We've talked enough. Let's get on to price.
So in the UK, this is going to cost 8,595 Brexit sterlings.
Wow.
Which is quite a competitive price, actually.
It's really competitive.
Slightly undercuts Honda's CBR 650R.
Yes, it does.
By like £4.
Yes.
Undercuts Suzuki's new GSX, got to get this right, GSX 8R.
That's it.
By about £300.
Yeah.
But it's also worth pointing out the Suzuki comes with a quick shifter as standard, whereas the Daytona 660 doesn't. And my guess is that by the time you've added a quick shifter, it will probably be there or thereabouts with the Suzuki. So comparable on that. Undercuts Yamaha's R7.
Yeah.
Whether you have that with or without a quick shifter. What else is it comparable to? What else would you pitch it against? Price-wise?
Price-wise? I don't know. I keep wanting to compare it to Kawasaki ZX6R, but have you mentioned the ZX4R then? Sorry, did you?
No, the ZX4. I did write that down. Do you know what? I should know that. It's about £8,806, I'd say.
Right,
it's
okay.
Just a rough guess.
I mean, I'm not sure if that's a competitor for this, to be honest. I don't really think it is. Kawasaki seem to be doing something that's completely out there, and with all their hybrid bikes, and they don't seem to be focusing on what other people are doing, and their categories are different to everybody else's. So should we talk about rivals and where this sits culturally in terms of its position in the firmament of motorcycling?
Well, if we go back to that introductory waffle that we did about how the supersports market has changed and died out and kind of found a new evolution or a new reboot, like I said, it seems like almost every manufacturer has a kind of a next generation softer super sports. I mean, I'm sort of reluctant to call it super sports. Middleweight sports bike, maybe.
I hate middleweight, but it's exactly what it is.
It is fair.
That's what it describes it.
Fair comment here.
Yeah.
So Honda CBR 650R has to be probably the most natural rival to it, I would say. Quite a good seller, as I understand. Yamaha R7, probably. A little bit down on power and tech, but maybe a bit higher on suspension spec on paper.
Okay, yeah.
Suzuki GSX-8R we've covered. Kawasaki ZX-4R. Now, Kawasaki have got about 8,000 middleweight sports bikes you can pick from, ranging from parallel twin 400s to inline 4 400s to parallel twin 600 650s to inline 4 600 650s. And so on and so on. So you can take your pick from them. I think the ZX-4RR probably is closest on tech, price and maybe power output, but you think the ZX6 might be a...
Well, I don't know. I've got this thing. It's kind of... it's about who's going to buy one of these. Who buys these middleweight, nicely priced sports bikes? How old are they? And what are they looking for in a bike? Because traditionally, if you were in your mid-30s and you wanted to buy a sports bike, you would naturally try and buy the most extreme spec you could find. So, you would be choosing you'd be looking at things like, which one's got fully adjustable suspension because I want that one.
Sure.
And the price is flexible. Everyone's got a budget, and then everyone's got something they can sell to exceed that budget. I'm going to sell my guitar, or I'm going to sell something else, and get this next step. And if you see 600s in that kind of, that hierarchy, I struggle to see... If I was a 30-year-old sporty person, I'd struggle to look at a ZX6R or a CBR 600.
Both of which reintroduced
reintroduced this year at, just over 10,000, 10,500. And this is 8.5, and you're talking $2,000. Would you not go and try and find that extra just to get to the next level? But if you're buying one of these because you want a softer sports bike, because you appreciate the riding position, and you will forego the super adjustable suspension and the super electronics and the IMUs
and the race bred pedigree
and the race business. Yeah. If you want to forego that, that's putting you off. That's who buys this bike. But for me, I can't help thinking at that age bracket, you'd kind of be going, I want the fastest one. But I could be wrong.
Yeah, I don't think you're alone in that consideration about how this compares to a kind of more traditional super sports bike, which do have more money spent on the suspension components and the brakes and the power, but then cost more in the showroom. Yeah. There will be lots of people watching this, listening to this, who are the same age as us, in 40s and 50s, who remember riding super sports bikes in the 90s and 2000s and are used to seeing full adjustment and really stiff suspension and massive power outputs and thinking, that's what I want, that's what a super sport bike should be. But I think those sales figures don't lie. Those historic sales figures for the past 10 or 20 years show which way, in my mind, people want their middleweight super sport bikes now.
Okay. Well, I guess the proof will be in the
pudding,
in the riding, in the sales figures pudding.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of even interesting just in the marketing. Like Triumph run all the engines in Moto 2, and there isn't a single mention of Moto 2 in anything to do with this bike as far as I've seen.
No, funny enough, they mentioned Moto 2 when they were talking about the Triumph Tiger updates,
right,
which is an adventure bike, but they haven't mentioned it with this.
Not that I've seen. And all the photos that I've seen of it, all the kind of press materials show people wearing kind of two-piece leathers, riding on the roads, haven't seen a single bit of elbow dragging on the track. So I think it's focusing at a different customer. I think perhaps your Supersport fan probably will go and stick with
the for sure.
But for people who don't want that, this would appear to be
and we have
a really
Triumph.
Promising new option.
So obviously Triumph haven't told us whether they're going to make a sporty 660R version, but it'd be interesting to find out when they do the launch whether they're going to launch it on a track or on the road or do a bit of track and road. That's going to be the real sort of teller, I think, and I suspect it's going to be on the road. Okay, so that's the sort of where the bike sits. We've been through the spec. I think we've just about thought. If we haven't mentioned something and we've forgotten something that you really want to know, ask us in the comments down below, and we'll stick it in there.
Simon will.
Yeah, I will. But yeah, I think we're just looking forward to riding this fella now, and it's a valuable addition to that kind of that range. There was a while ago I was thinking the CBR 650 was the last kind of inline four in that category, and everything was a parallel twin. And I was thinking the future is parallel twins. So thank you, Triumph, for making a triple.
To introducing a new engine configuration to that class.
Based on the spec, it's going to be really good fun riding it.
Yeah, should be. So this comes into UK dealers in April. As we record this in, what month are we in? January?
Yep.
So we're still a few months away from it. But interesting to throw a leg over and all the other cliches.
Yeah, it will be. Right, I think we've talked enough about this bike. I think
we have.
Yeah, like I say, if there's anything you want to know, ask down below. And yes, and what would we normally say? We normally say, please like and subscribe. It's a new channel, so we're going to be adding more content, hopefully a bit like this, hopefully some launches, hopefully some other stuff, and we'll see how we get on. Please listen to the podcast.
Yes, if you've watched this and thinking, who are these two morons? I definitely want to hear more of them talking. We have done a podcast pretty much every 2 weeks for about the past 10 years at this point. It's called Front End Chatter. You can find it on all your normal podcast apps. You can find it on the Bennett's Bike Social website, bikesocial.co.uk. Thank you very much for watching.
Thank you.
We'll see you at some non-specific point in the future.
Hopefully.
I mean, I don't want to overcommit.
Yeah.
I might not ever see them ever again.
We're raising the expectations.
Yeah.
Well, you say that. I mean,
under-deliver and over... No, which way around is it?
I don't know. If this was a load of rubbish, then we're actually sort of like, no, keep those expectations high. Yeah. Good. Excellent. Right. That was the outtake.
Goodbye.
Yes. Beep, beep, beep. No, I was just record me sitting here drinking water. Good. Right, turn everything off.
I think that's right. I mean, we covered tech, we covered opinion, we covered market. There might have been a bit of repeating, but... Is that off again? No, it's still good.